Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 6, Covenant Advocates, the Prophets of Ancient Israel. Just a reminder that this online lecture as well as the class lecture are merely samplings of what you find in the textbook. For a deeper knowledge of the concept, please read the textbook. Our discussion today is based on the view through the historical lens. In so doing, we can ask, what is a prophet? A prophet is not someone who predicts the future, but is a forthteller who speaks the word of the Lord to people of their own time. The Hebrew word for prophet is nabi, which literally means one who announces, or one who is called. It appears over 300 times in the Hebrew Bible. Anthropologically speaking, there are two categories of human attempts to communicate with the spirit or the beyond the ordinary world. One is shamans, who have an inborn gift of moving between the two worlds. The other are medicine women or men, who use spells, drugs, and other means to move between the two worlds. Ancient Near Eastern cultures witness both type of phenomena. In the Bible, we hear of the hand, or the Spirit of the Lord, being on the prophet, like a shaman-like possession, for example, the oracles of the Lord. Other passages suggest the prophets actually find themselves in the court of the Lord. You can find an account of this in the first book of Kings, chapter 22, verse 19. They could be perceived also as being dangerous since they speak the word of God. Ultimately, the criteria of a true prophet is if their word or prophecy comes true. Historically speaking, what we see in the Bible are three types of prophets: cultic prophets associated with shrines and temples, royal prophets, members of the royal court, and the sons of prophets, which consist of guilds of prophets. In the Bible, we see prophets doing a variety of things. Samuel delivered divine oracles to Saul, conversed with God. He anointed and denounced kings. Elijah, Elisha, and Nathan felt themselves commissioned to make and unmake monarchs. Nathan, Gad, Isaiah, and Jeremiah all advised kings. Some announced oracles. They had access to the spiritual world and were ambassadors of the divine court to earthly seats of power. They also interceded to God on behalf of earthly powers. The prophets had a number of elements in common. All shared in a demand for justice and righteousness. In other words, they sought a government that would create a just and human social order according to the Torah. All prophets denounced the veneration of other gods. Baal, the Canaanite god, was the object of the greatest prophetic ire. They also brought messages of warning if abuse of the covenant continued. For example, when Isaiah spoke the oracle to King Ahaz about the birth of a child named Emmanuel, he was addressing a particular situation of the time. For Christians, when we hear the term Emmanuel, alarm bells ring. But in this context, we need a clarification. The theological use of this text by the New Testament to see a prediction of the coming of Jesus lies outside the bounds of the historical method. It is legitimate for theological or devotional interpretation, but outside a historical analysis. In other words, as a historian looking at this text, we cannot infer that that is referring to Jesus. Certainly from a theological point of view we can, but not from a historical one. Note as well the term Messiah is a transliteration from the Hebrew word Mashiach, translated into the Greek as Christos, which we apply to Jesus of Nazareth. Originally, it refers to someone who has been anointed with oil. In the Tanakh, it is commonly used to refer to the kings who perpetuate the Davidic dynasty. Only later does it come to be associated with the hope that God would lift up an ideal king to restore the Davidic dynasty. None of the prophetic books of the Tanakh use the term with this meaning. Of note, in Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1, the term Messiah is applied to the Persian king Cyrus the Great, and later in Habakkuk chapter 3:13, it refers to the people of Israel as anointed by God. Messianic thinking in Judaism emerges much later in the literature between 200 and 100 BCE. In a sense, prophecy was always present in the charismatic aspect of religion. However, prophecy as a distinct phenomenon begins to appear in materials associated with the Philistine oppression that also led to the rise of the state and monarchy. Samuel is the first individual to portray characteristics of what was later deemed to be prophecy. In David's court, Gad the seer served as an intermediary between the Lord and David. Later, Nathan was a central figure in David's court. He approves and later forbids the Davidic temple. He condemns David of his sin against Uriah. He is a key figure in the coup that leads to Solomon's accession. In these early periods, we see that prophets are quite potent. The Aramean Wars of the 9th century were the occasion for another upsurge of prophetic activity. The prophets here, on the one hand, were patriots, but on the other condemned the house of Ahab. The principal prophets of this time are Elijah and Elisha, his successor. In Table 6.1, which you can find in your textbook, we find the prophets of ancient Israel beginning with Elijah. Notice on one column we have the prophet and their location, and then on the third column we have the corresponding ruler or rulers. In between we have the dates. What we notice here are prophets that speak in the courts and provide wisdom to those rulers, guidance, or even strong criticism. A strong candidate for a test question would be to take one prophet, perhaps Jeremiah, and to look at it from a historical and literary perspective. From a historical perspective, to discuss the entire background in terms of their prophecy. From a literary perspective, to consider some key themes in their prophecy. The prophet Elijah is portrayed as a person of remarkable strength and energy, whose rude and unusual costume may symbolize rejection of settled agrarian life and above all urban life. Elijah appears to be the adversary of King Ahab, but his real target was the patronage of the Baal cult by Queen Jezebel. The Elijah cycle ends with his being taken up to heaven by a whirlwind while horses and chariots of fire interpose between Elijah and his successor Elisha. In comparison, both were wonder workers, performing feeding miracles and resuscitating dead children. Elisha headed a band of prophets of which Elijah was the head. Elisha instigates the murder of the sick king Ben-Hadad by his servant. He then sends one of his disciples to anoint General Jehu king in place of Jehoram. Jehu goes berserk and a bloodbath ensues. Among the dead are Jezebel, mother of Jehoram. This act was allegedly to honor the God of Israel, since Jezebel had allowed pagan temples to exist in the kingdom. Elijah's reaction to the excesses of Jehu is not recorded, but the 8th century prophet Hosea condemned it in unconditional terms. Prior to this, Israelite prophets appeared as revolutionary activists, but after Jehu's bloodbath, the prophets seemed to recoil from such direct revolutionary action. By the time the cycles of tradition in the earliest section of the latter prophets emerged, the prophets seemed to have settled into a less violent diplomatic role, serving as advocates rather than activists.